Thank you.
Can I say something first?
I'm anchoring this. I'm the anchor.
I know
You're
you
not
are.
the anchor.
I know. But I do have to say something first. Is that I loved the cheers and applause for Lawrence O'Donnell because I'm having like a pinch me moment that I'm sitting here at the 92nd Street Y with Lawrence O'Donnell. So he's the greatest. And it's a little extra applause for Lawrence.
So I'm told we only have an hour. So the praise between us is going
We'll stop.
We're gonna have to hold it
We
to
like each other.
We're going to have to hold it to a minimum. I'm in awe of Jen Psaki for so many reasons, including something I can only confess here and would not want known by a national TV audience, even though this is streaming.
Hello, everyone.
So the 24 of you out there, don't tell anyone. Televised press conferences that included White House press secretaries began during my lifetime. I've seen every one of them. Every single one of them, beginning with Pierre Salinger in JFK's White House, which some of you will remember. And when I saw Jen Psaki do it, I realized I had never seen anything like it before. The best White House press secretary I've ever seen, ever. So, enough about me. It's Jen's night. One more thing about me, though. This is the good news. This is the good news. This is the last you'll see of me tonight. No need to rush home for the 10 p.m. show.
Take your time.
Except the Jonathan Capehart fans among you. Jonathan's at the desk tonight. I have to be down at the courthouse at 7:30 a.m. tomorrow, and Friday. So we're marshaling my strength and I'm using this as my excuse. So I'm not sure. I want to begin with something that one of the many things I didn't get to raise with Jen on the show Monday night when we first talked about this book. And I did everything I could possibly do to sell it, including at the very end, when it occurred to me to sell it as a Mother's Day book, which it really, really is.
It is.
No, it really is.
Only a few days.
I mean, I know, yes, there's more interesting stuff about Barack Obama in here than I have read in any book not written by Barack Obama. More interesting stuff about Joe Biden, the person, the real person, who I know, John Kerry, the person, the real person who I know. I learned more about them in this book, and I've never learned more about them in any other people who've written about them. But about half of this book is motherhood. It is the experience of motherhood in the highest pressure workplaces in the world that you could possibly have to deal with all of that. And it includes some truly remarkable scenes. But it also brings to mind, to me, something that the wonderful Chris Matthews said to me before MSNBC was invented back in 1993, in the first 6 months of the Clinton White House. And I was in the Senate working for Senator Moynihan, Chief of Staff of the Senate Finance Committee. He was the chairman of the Finance Committee. Many of you voted for him. Thank you for that. And Chris was watching. He was a columnist at the time, and he had a show on a cable channel that preceded MSNBC. And Chris, in that just machine gun way of talking that he had, grabbed me one day somewhere and said to me about the Clinton White House and the Clinton administration. He said to me, "You know what's wrong with those people? You know what's wrong with those people? I'll tell you what's wrong with those people. Not enough of those people have kids." And I heard it in about June of 1993, which meant I was 1 year away from having a kid. And I realized two things at the same time. One, I just heard something profound. And two, I don't know what it means. And you do.
We were just talking about this backstage, and I talk about this in the book a bit, but I didn't tell this part in the book, is that when I came back from maternity leave, from having my daughter, and let me just actually reverse for a second, because I went back to the White House to work for Barack Obama as his communications director when I was 6 months pregnant, which is an insane thing to do, I think it's safe to say. But I learned a lot about myself and about limitations that I and so many young women, perhaps men too, as fathers, put on themselves when they are becoming parents or they are parents. Becoming a parent changes you. It doesn't change who you are at the same thing and the things you're passionate about. And I tell this story in the book, but I was about 4 months pregnant with my daughter, who's now 8.5, precocious and about my height because I'm 5'3". And I was pregnant with her, and Dennis McDonough, the White House chief of staff at the time, who Lawrence loves the detail that he did change my daughter's diapers at some point in the White House, he called me and he said, Jen, the president wants you to come back and be the White House communications director. And that's an amazing call to get for anyone. Of course, it's a dream job. But in the 15 seconds he was saying that, I thought to myself, he doesn't know I'm pregnant. I'm going to tell him I'm pregnant, and he's going to say, good luck with life, or something. And it was such a lesson to me in limiting yourself, because that's basically what I said to him. I said, I haven't told a lot of people this. I'm about 4 months pregnant. But I really appreciate you reaching out. I said something along those lines, to which he said, that's amazing, and it's so exciting. We'll figure it out, and I'll call you tomorrow. Which Dennis made me, it's true, it made me remember. Now, the last part of this story is that Dennis said, the president's gonna call you in the next couple of days. And I said, oh, okay. So I'm kind of shell-shocked in this moment. President Obama calls me, and I told my mom at the time, even if I didn't take the job, I would always remember the story, because President Obama said, hey, Jen, it's President Obama. I only have a few minutes because the king's in my office. And he meant the king of Jordan, literally, the king. But he said to me, I hear you're expecting your first child. That's amazing. Being a dad is the greatest thing that's ever happened to me. We'll figure it out. And we did. I mean, it really is speaks to them and who they are. Okay, now I'm going to fast forward. That wasn't even the story you asked me to tell, but I felt people needed to know that part. When I went back to work after...
By the way, we're in no hurry.
Yeah.
Here's the weird thing about this. No commercials.
Oh, it's true.
None.
You can just keep talking.
Zero.
Oh, and also...
So you can your answers can be paragraphs.
I love
They don't have to be...
Also, Lawrence isn't going back for his show because he's got to be there for
Yeah.
Stormy Daniels' Cross tomorrow. So there's that. Right, and he's going to tell us all about it in the courtroom, and if Trump leers at him, which might happen again. So this could all happen tomorrow. So he has to rest up. This is his rest. Anyway, the point is, what we were talking about backstage is related to Lawrence's story and what Chris Matthews conveyed, is when I went back to work after 12 weeks of maternity leave, which I asked for. No one had ever had. They made a policy then at the White House that they would have maternity leave, which is amazing. I went back and I realized, first of all, President Obama was like, you're back already? I was like, what? Because you're so stressed. Right. And I went back and I realized I love my job. And it was this epiphany I had. I love my daughter, but I also love my job. And it was really being a parent that made me realize I loved being in public service. I loved being a part of policymaking and working in the White House. And having a daughter meant I had a different and more expanded perspective.
Yeah, so you worked as the press secretary for the State Department, Secretary of State John Kerry, before press secretary at the White House for Joe Biden. And one of the things that's so interesting about that, it's really hard for me when I look at each of those jobs to decide which one would scare me the most, especially since your motto for that first one as press secretary for the State Department was what?
Don't start a war. Or actually, you know what? I'll modify it. It was, don't start a war within your first 5 months. Because if it's in 5 months, maybe people will be like, oh, she's all right. She started a war. But, that was my motto for that job when I was in it for 2.5 years, actually.
Yeah, and so one of the great things about the book that you discover as you go through it is it's not chronological. Don't think you're finished with the State Department just because this story has moved on to the White House or to White House press secretary. And it's actually quite late in the book where there's a State Department passage where you find out, the reader finds out, what the word Psakiing means, which came from a little place called Russia.
It did. So long before, it was common knowledge that there was a Russian propaganda machine. I mean, Lawrence probably knew, but most people didn't know. I was the spokesperson at the State Department in 2014 and 2015. At that time, Russia invaded Ukraine, and therefore I became the face of the US opposition to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. I've long been banned from going to Russia. I haven't been able to journey to Moscow for a vacation for probably a decade now. I'm okay. But in that time, because of that, the Russian propaganda machine turned themselves on me. Now, I was very newly on the public scene. I had not been a public spokesperson in that way for some time. They had a nightly show on RT, Russia Today, where they talked primarily about me and tried to peel apart things that I was saying that were accurate about what they were doing. They coined this term, Psakiing, which they meant not knowing what you're talking about. I was on Kremlin playing cards, reportedly. I never found them. If anyone has them, I'd love some. And I was talked about by Foreign Minister Lavrov, Putin, and others. Now, this all is fun and games to talk about now. At the time, if you're wondering, how does it feel to be the victim, the target of Russian propaganda? Not great, is the answer. Not great. But what it taught me, and this is why I wanted to talk about it in the book, is about how to fight back against bullies. And I felt nervous, I felt embarrassed. A lot of it was gendered and how they were going after me, about what I was wearing or my hair. I fractured bones in my foot, and they had a theory about the boot that I had on my foot for a while. I mean, it was very crazy. And I actually got a great piece of advice from the State Department press corps. Is remarkable. They're brilliant. They work together. They know more about foreign policy than, frankly, some people who work in the US government at times. And a former Moscow bureau chief, whose name I did not include in the book because I didn't want him to be, targeted or whatever, said to me, "You know this is a badge of honor, right? They think that your message is effective, so they need to dismantle it so their public doesn't listen to you." And it kind of entirely changed my perspective. And I started to fight back and started to have fun with it. And I went out to the briefing a couple of days later, and I talked about why they were targeting me, because they didn't like that I was calling out the illegal invasion of Ukraine. And they didn't like that I was sharing facts about what they were doing and lying to their own public. And it changed my perspective on propaganda, changed my perspective certainly on Russia. Now, the funny part of it, there's a funny part of this story, I promise, is fast forward years later, and I'm working for President Biden. And President Biden has a meeting with Vladimir Putin, which is it was a Russia-US summit. It was a kind of a very big deal. And I'm at the meeting, but I'm not in the press conference. I'm just with the press. I'm not even in the press conference. Out of nowhere, Vladimir Putin brings me up and says that I am something like educated and pretty, but uninformed.
Come on, though. I mean, when you think about it,
it's
there's so much worse he could have said.
It's true, but it's
I'd be thrilled to get away with it.
It's also creepy. He might, But the point is, he's still trying to discredit me years later. That is what they do. That's what bullies and propagandists do, which I think there's some applicability to what we're seeing in our country now today, too.
So, I decided to fact check this section of the book. Yeah.
Did I butcher it a little?
No.
Okay.
I just want you to know this, because in the pages that talk about Psakiing and how this was going on, you do talk about how it got to you.
Yeah.
And how there were times where you were obsessed with it.
Yeah.
Jumping back into the van and checking what was being said.
Yeah.
So, This is from Undersecretary of State Rick Stengel at the time.
Oh.
Because he urged me to bring up this section of the book.
Oh, okay. I love this. It's a little
here's-
throwback machine.
And here's what he said. He texted me this right out on 92nd Street before I came in. He said, she was in some ways the canary in the coal mine of Russian disinformation. RT, Russian TV, attacked her day after day, plus many others. I never even saw her get the least bit upset or unnerved by it. She just did her job and was unfazed as far as I could tell. So you fooled him.
That's an honor that he said that. And I worked closely with Rick Stengel at the time. I wanted to talk about how I was feeling because I think it's important for people to know that, and especially people who are earlier in their career than I am. And I did feel at the time like I was a distraction from US policy with Russia, like I wasn't handling it the right way, and it felt very bad. And at the time, I felt, because I was young in that job, and I kind of can joke now, I actually went to like a consignment store when I was at the State Department. I was like younger than most people who had the job, and I bought some old knit suits, so I looked older. But I didn't want to show that I was impacted by it. And I think that is, often how people behave, and certainly I have in my career, but I wanted this book to also give people license to be vulnerable and know that for those of us who have journeyed through a career, we've made mistakes, we've had to be vulnerable. Vulnerability is not a weakness, it's part of your journey. And so that's why I wanted to talk about it in the book.
Yeah. So there are so many books and things I've read about actors and acting where I read a passage and I think, this applies. This thing about, rejection and audition and rehearsal, or this kind of insight, this applies to so many things in life. I wish people would read this and take this lesson. This is the only thing I've ever read outside of actor memoir that actually informs the show business life and the actor life, because there's so much backstage, on stage in this book. And there's so much nervousness and shimmying backstage. And what I love about it is it's when I saw you take that stage in the White House for the first time. I really was watching the best, and what I was watching was, for me, the new visual definition of confidence. Like that, I'm going to replace whatever definition I had of confidence before I saw Jen Psaki in the White House press briefing room. Turns out it wasn't that way the night before in the kitchen.
So I'm a bit of a prepper for things, the night before, because I had worked in the White House before, I had sat in many press briefings. I had fallen asleep in some before. They can be a little repetitive and boring. It's true, there's no visuals of this that I'm aware of. Now someone will find one, and that's okay. But I knew that there'd be a range of topics raised. And I knew actually that the most important thing I had to do that day was deliver on, to the best of my ability, what President Biden had asked me to do, which was lower the temperature in that room, try to take some venom out of the exchanges. You can debate, you can disagree, that's part of our democracy, but you do not need to attack the press, right? You should not lie, of course. And so I knew I'd be asked how I approached the job, so I spent a lot of time thinking about that and what I would say. And at about 11 o'clock at night, which I'm kind of a morning person, I'm not as much of a night owl, but I've become one, I guess. But in this job, I was not as much, and I was pacing around my living room. I was like, oh my God, what if somebody asked me about Venezuela? I'm not briefed on Venezuela. I don't know enough about Venezuela. And I was like, oh God, I have to learn about Venezuela. I don't know why it was Venezuela. I think maybe because I'd worked at the State Department. And my husband, who's a very calm cat, except for the Cincinnati Bengals, if they're losing, then he gets very stressed. But other than that, he was like, what is happening right now? Why are you pacing around? And I told him, he was like, that's not gonna come up. He was right. I eased myself. I went to bed. I will say, because I gave the briefing at 7 p.m., and I was on Inauguration Day, which you don't get in until noon on Inauguration Day. They don't let you in the building until noon. So it's a pretty fast turnaround. I had so many cups of coffee that day, so many. We also had met on a bus. We'd met at the National Zoo to take buses from the National Zoo to the White House because of security.
Which means you watched your president, your boss, President Biden's inauguration, not from one of those prized seats at the Capitol. How did you watch it?
I watched it with a double mask on a bus on my phone on the way to the White House. In part,
it was really good, Tony.
It was very good. I couldn't
Should
tell.
watch it sometime.
I couldn't tell what was on Lady Gaga's, what the brooch was. It was very hard to see on the cell phone. It was reflective of the time. In the double masks, of course, but we met at the zoo because of January 6th. It was just 2 weeks after the insurrection. That was when his inauguration was. And so I had a lot of coffee, and I didn't sleep the next night, really, but somehow I made it through the second briefing, fortunately.
So these three very important people you've worked for, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, John Kerry. I just want to go through, for the audience, some of these basic elements about them. And if you watch the show Monday night, don't spoil it for the rest of the class. Which one of them terrified you?
Barack Obama.
Cuddly Barack Obama. Oh, yeah, not in the office.
No, and we talked, not to spoil, no one spoiled it. That was good.
Right, thank you.
He terrified me because, I mean, this was now when I started working for him 15, 16 years ago. And he had already given the speech at the 2004 convention, kind of a really life-changing speech for a lot of us in politics.
The best convention speech in the history of televised convention.
The best convention speech ever. He's a larger-than-life figure, but he is also someone, and I worked for him for 10 years, who is so thoughtful and so introspective and so nuanced in the best way possible. In a world of everything is this way or that way, there's so many times where I've thought, I just want to call him and ask him what he thinks of this. Mm-hmm. And that is who he is. So I was terrified of saying something. Now, I got over this, as I talk about in the book, over the course of time. But I was terrified of saying something stupid. I was terrified not of him as a person. He's a lovely human. But terrified of saying something stupid, of saying something wrong. And so what I did instead was I said very little to nothing for the first couple of years in meetings with him because of that fear. It's almost paralyzing and exhausting. And it took me some time to really get through that. And you also had a fear.
I had exactly the same strategy. And I stumbled into politics through the 1988 Writers Guild strike. We were on strike for almost 6 months, and Senator Moynihan asked me to come into his re-election campaign here. I knew nothing about politics. His wife was running the campaign, and the suspense was he going to win 68 or 67% of the vote? There's nothing I could do. I wasn't going to have any impact on that, and there were maybe 4 of us working on the whole thing. And my strategy around him, because here's the towering world-class intellect, Harvard professor, who I found very intimidating as a faculty figure in those days. And so my strategy around him was, it was the same thing. The fear was entirely about, okay, he's way too smart for me to say a word in front of or to ever. So I was silent for 1 year. And what that meant to him was, there was one person here who hadn't said anything stupid in a year.
So it's not a terrible strategy.
What's his name? Bring him over here. So yes, and that's my advice. I tell people that all the time. You're never going to be penalized. This is true in all sorts of jobs, especially one of the jobs I spent most of my time in, which was in writers' rooms for TV drama in Hollywood. One of the big mistakes to make in that room is to have a lot to say. That's the biggest mistake you can make, because the likelihood is most of what we say in those creative suggestions are wrong or will fall flat quickly. And if you haven't said anything yet, then you haven't made any mistakes yet, you know. But your version of it was really great to read. And then there's, of course, the guy in this book who you're intimidated about the job interview. You're not quite sure, this is true in more than one of your job interviews here, you're not quite sure you're up to the job. Mm-hmm. And that job interview ends in a bear hug.
Yes. So
who's that guy?
John Kerry, who I worked for him on his presidential campaign. And one of the things I've learned from working in politics, and we tried to kind of showcase this on our show, is that politicians are caricatured. That's just, and I have had the honor of spending time with a lot of them. And John Kerry has this reputation, and you know him too, of being cold and aloof and unfriendly. He is the opposite. He's like a Labrador, a tall one. And he is so warm and so friendly and tireless. And he reminds me of, there's a story that Reagan used to tell about when you go, two kids who go into kind of a barn and there's piles of manure and one of them says it smells bad and the other one says, where's the horse? John Kerry's always looking for the horse. And that's why he was such a tireless diplomat. But after our interview, he said, all right, come on up and give me a hug. And I was like, okay. So I do talk about that in the book as well.
And by the way, the Kerry hug is something that Undersecretary of State Rick Stengel was talking about today too.
So he's hugging everybody.
But and then of course, and by process of elimination, you can all guess, who's the guy who got on the phone with your father?
Joe Biden. First of all, yes. Joe Biden loves to call people's parents and family members. If you ever meet him in this room, just come prepared, because we all don't really always know cell phone numbers because they're just on our phone. Just come prepared with the number. He will call them. But this was only a couple of months into working for him. It was Greek Independence Day. I'm about a sixth Greek of some version. Psaki is Greek, and I was going to introduce him at Greek Independence Day. And I thought in my I'm so busy mode, I would just get on a Zoom and say, and now the President of the United States. But no, that is not how Joe Biden operates. I was called, came into the Oval Office. He grilled me on how I'd be introducing him, how I would talk about my own Greek heritage. We had to practice it so I could show him what I was going to say. Then he brought me with him, and I sat right next to him at the Greek Independence Day event. I think people were wondering, why is this person here? But on the way back, he called my dad, and he wanted to talk to my dad about Greek heritage. The president was silent for a while, which I thought, oh God, my dad is talking this entire time. And what is he saying right now? So that was a little bit of a stressor, but he did call my dad. He has that is who he is. So bring your cell phones and your phone numbers if you ever meet him.
There's a great line in here, please, about John Kerry. Secretary Kerry's optimism was one of the qualities that made me love working for him. It was also one of the hardest qualities to manage from a communications perspective.
So, especially as a diplomat, he's the chief diplomat of the United States as Secretary of State. And it also means he's the head negotiator of kind of any deal. When I was working for him, there was Middle East peace negotiations that were happening. Bashar al-Assad decided to kill people in his own country with chemical weapons. There was a coup, we didn't call a coup in Egypt, but it was a coup. I can say that now on the record clearly. There were so many things going on in the world. Iran nuclear deal negotiations. Actually, Ben Rhodes, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor, about 8 months into my job, called me and said, I swear, when I convince you to do this job, it is not always like this. It's like, it was an amazing job. But what it meant is Secretary Kerry, because he's tireless and optimistic, he wears people down, including diplomats. But when he would go out to press conferences, sometimes people would say, how are the negotiations going? And he'd say, they're great, we're almost there. And we weren't necessarily almost there. And that's one part. But also, communications is a tool. It's a tool in negotiations, whether it's on Capitol Hill or in diplomacy, to send a message to the person you're negotiating with. And so it was important for him to use it that way, to say, well, we're still open, we are still at the table having a discussion, but there are some difficulties and some asks that we're not sure if we can get there from the other side. What message are you sending then? You're sending the message that they better come to you with a better proposal the next time. So it was hard to manage in that time. I tell a story in this book. I've mentioned already that I'm 5'3". It comes up a lot in the book because I worked for a lot of people who are quite tall. And John Kerry is about 6'4".
Yeah.
And so there was one particular time I was with him during most of the Iran nuclear deal negotiations. Sometimes they were through the night, they were long. And it was with other European countries and leaders, the Russians, the Chinese. We were pretty close to the deal at this point, or we were close to the interim deal at this point, and he was going to go to a press conference. And I was prepping him for the press conference, and he is a very energetic person. And he got up at one point and just leapt up and said, "Okay, I'm ready to go." And I was thinking, oh no, he's going to go out there and tell them we're about to get the deal done, and we're not quite there, and we still have some messages we need to send. So in the movie version of this,
this whole book is the movie version.
The movie
I'm
version.
telling you, the lines are fantastic, the scenes are fantastic.
It is. Well, in the West Wing episode of this, in the West Wing version that Lawrence would have written this episode, I am sprinting, running, but like at twice the pace because he's that much taller, after him through the hallway with all of these European delegations looking at me while I'm saying, "That's not credible, you can't say that, that's not credible." And I'm sure people were looking at me like, what is happening? But what I learned about giving feedback to him, I mean, the man fought in Vietnam and came back and protested the war and has won multiple Purple Hearts. He's not exactly a shrinking violet. That I could give him tough feedback. And in order for him to hear, he could do what he wanted. He's a Secretary of State. But I needed to make it tough, and I needed to make it direct. And that's what I learned. To the point where some people, CEOs, other diplomats would say, "Well, you're very direct with him." It's like, yes, because that's what he needed.
Right.
But that's not how I was with every single boss I worked for.
Right. Yeah, I have to say the optimism when I went into government after that '88 campaign and went to working in the Senate, the optimism was the thing that shocked me. Bill Bradley was such an optimist. John Kerry was an optimist. Ted Kennedy, an optimist. And I thought, the Irish aren't optimists. How can this be? And then Pat Moynihan he was a short-term realist and a long-term optimist, and his definition of optimism was, well, we can get it done. You know, it might take 30 years, right? Like, for example, Moynihan Train Hall, which took him 30 years.
Yeah.
And
it's beautiful.
And he died 20 years into the project. But the first 20 years, it was him alone and nobody else. And none of us thought it was going to get done except him, you know. And so, and what's so fascinating about that optimism inside, it's held by the people who should be the most cynical. These are the people who have to go out and get the votes and campaign. And I was coming into it from the outside world where we were all cynics, and I was suddenly among these people who took an oath of office, and it seemed like optimism was part of the oath or something.
Which is so, I mean, this is another thing I hope people, and we talked about a little bit about this on Monday night, is that I hope people take away from the book is we're living in a pretty dark and scary time, I think it's safe to say. Public service and people who are in public service, civil servants, foreign service officers, people who serve as political appointees, there is this air of optimism. It is people who want to do good and want to make the country a better place. And that was very much my experience. And it is something that is such an important part of our country, people who serve in the government. And I hope that people take away that joy and that honor that I felt in being a part of that, because sometimes you lose that in all the attacks on our institutions and the attacks on so many people who have served in office.
So someone said this about Jen Psaki, said this about her job as White House press secretary. "I could never do your job. I would just want to rip their heads off." Now, just a show of hands, how many people agree with that in the audience? Yeah, see, I just want you to see that, because you've got to explain to them whatever it was you said to your father when he said that to you.
It was my father. I said to my dad, well, that's not, the goal of communicating is actually...
Oh, so what? I want to rip their heads off.
I know. Well, I will say about my dad, who consumes a lot of news. It's amazing and remarkable. But if he has a thought in his mind, you could kind of get up, refill your wine glass, use the ladies' room. He's still, going. So it's okay. He didn't take it too personally, I don't think, when I gave him that feedback. I will say, I read about this in here, but Dana Perino, who was a predecessor of mine, of course, worked under the Bush administration. She wrote in her book something I never did, and I wish I would have done, or thought of, or read her book soon enough to do it. In the podium, there is a little hole for a cup, like a mug of water or something. When the press in the briefing room were getting particularly edgy or on her nerves, she would just flip him the bird right in there. Nobody could see it. And it was like, you're saying like this, and you're just like,
oh man, I'm telling you.
I never did that. I wish I would have known earlier, but that was some advice you should have given me.
I really don't want Aaron Sorkin to ever hear this or read this book, because there's so many missed opportunities in here for the writer's room at the West Wing when we were writing that fictional White House that Aaron created. There's so many of those moments, including that we didn't get to. And this would fit nicely in the West Wing TV show. The White House press secretary, at home, forced to spin her children about the tooth fairy. Now, this is why I say it's a Mother's Day book. The tooth fairy comes up for an awful lot of mothers out there.
Yes.
There's a moment when you shade the truth a little bit.
That's true. And the story I tell in there is actually about someone conveying to my kids, that the tooth fairy wasn't a thing. And so it was like, how do you save it in that moment? And what I did in the moment was I changed the name of the person, because I said, Vivi, Mary must not have lost a tooth for a while, because she does not remember what happens when you lose a tooth, and obviously the tooth fairy comes. And Mary's an adult, so it's probably been 30 years. Mary doesn't remember. So here's the thing we're gonna do. When you lose your next tooth, we're gonna call Mary, and we're gonna tell her what the tooth fairy brings you. And she was like, okay. I'm like, but kids are, as we've been talking about, so remarkable, and what I've learned so much from them. I mean, I still, this probably means I haven't exactly become the most disciplined person in putting my kids to bed. I'm still like laying in bed with my children for like an hour and a half at night when I put them to bed, which I also enjoy, and we have the best conversations. But when people say, oh, I just send them upstairs and put them to bed, I'm like, how does that work? I need like a tutorial. But we have the best conversations, and it is amazing to me, and I always learn from what my kids ask me about, because they do consume things. My kids, I tell the story in there about my daughter asking me around the early days of Russia invading Ukraine. She wasn't watching like, PBS NewsHour every day, but she'd just seen it, and she said, how do wars start? She was probably 6 or 7.
Wow.
How do wars start? It's such an existential question that often you don't talk about like that. And I said, well, sometimes somebody wants somebody else's land, which was the case here. Sometimes it's about religion, sometimes. And I was thinking, I'm not really sure that she kind of consumed that. But then later on, weeks later, she was saying to her younger brother, hey, buddy, did you know wars start because somebody wants their neighbor's land? And my son said, like Max and Aiden who live next door, like they want our land? I was like, I sort of got them there, but the point is, they bring you so back to earth sometimes, which is a very refreshing thing about being a parent.
So there are some just remarkable hunks of dialogue in here that, again, just drives me nuts that we didn't discover this on the
Aaron
West Wing.
Sorkin calls Lawrence and I are going to do a reboot.
Oh man,
Everybody wants a reboot.
We would never attempt to write one of those scripts again without you, because there's moments like this. Nice to meet you, I said, after Bill introduced us. This is probably the closest we'll ever get, Rahm responded.
Yes.
That is the best opening line of any scene I could imagine. Rahm Emanuel, very tough guy. Who then, on the next page, it turns out, ends every phone call with, I love you.
Yes, true. Rahm Emanuel, I worked for when he was the chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. He's great. All of the expletives people say he says, that's true. I can confirm that. And he was a tough and brilliant boss, and I worked for him twice. But yes, the first time we met, that's exactly what he said to me. And then actually, our relationship grew when at one point he asked me to call a New York Times reporter. I said, great, I'm happy to call that reporter. I went to the ladies' room, I came back, called the reporter, and the reporter said, oh, I just heard from Rahm Emanuel. He just called me about this same story, which kind of makes you mad when you're working for him. Mm-hmm. And in the moment, I was mad, and I got up from my desk, and I went into his office, and I said, either you're the spokesperson or I'm the spokesperson. You decide, which I wouldn't advise that necessarily. But in the moment, what it did was it showed him that I wasn't afraid of him. And that he could give me tough feedback. And that doesn't work for everybody. I would never have done that to Joe Biden or Barack Obama.
Right.
But with Rahm Emanuel, it meant he could give me tough feedback. And he could call me and say, what the bleep is going on with this story? And I would tell him. And then he'd say, okay, love you, bye.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, and this is I'll stop with the fictional scene I wish I'd written moment. So who's the other person in this scene that begins with you saying, I bet you're wondering who I am and why I'm in your car?
Barack Obama.
That's how she meets Barack
Obama. I worked for him. I started working for him the week he announced his plan to run for presidency. I wanted to work for him the moment I saw him at that convention. Like so many people, I actually was backstage at that. I was at the convention. I did not see the speech because Jon Favreau, who now hosts a podcast, Pod Save America, he and I were backstage with his daughters who were fighting over who was going to introduce their dad at the convention. Mm-hmm. So therefore, I missed Barack Obama's speech. It's okay, because I worked for him for 10 years. That aside, I was asked to go staff him, go be his staffer, at an event in Cincinnati, Ohio, in October of 2007. Incidentally, this was the same day I ended up meeting my future in-laws. It was a big day, it turns out, in my life. But I was and they put me in his car because they're waiting for the candidate to land, and they want to just get going in the motorcade as soon as he gets there. So I'm awkwardly sitting in his car, waiting for this larger-than-life figure who I'd wanted to work for multiple years. I was a little nervous. And I was like, okay, I need a good line to come up with, right? So I came up with this line, and I was like, I'm very slick. He got in the car, and I said, you may be wondering who I am and why I'm in your car. And he kind of laughed, and I was like, oh, I'm so good.
Yeah, you rolled with it.
Okay. I was like, I am very slick. This is like the coolest man in America, and I'm cool too.
Yeah.
Okay. That lasted for 5 seconds until the handle of my bag got caught on the door. The entire contents of my bag, like pens, lipstick, tampons, I mean, everything, on the lap of the future leader of the free world. So he helped me put it back in, and in the moment I was like, maybe this is it. Maybe he's gonna be like, please don't send that crazy person out with me again. But then I ended up working for him for 10 years and traveled with him to almost every campaign event he ever did. So it worked out.
And your daughters in high school and college who are thinking about following in Jen's career footsteps, that scene in all those details is in this book. They can see exactly how to handle it. So the last thing I want to do is get serious here, which is why I'm bringing it up last. There's a passage in here that says, your experience at the White House podium, every outlet from print to television wants to get a clip of their reporter asking the big question of the day. This means that a briefing can be like listening to a song on repeat. Each reporter asks a question and gets an answer, and then the next reporter asks the same question and gets the same answer, and the next and the next. And since each reporter wants to show their viewers that they're tough and not afraid to ask the hard questions, not only are they asking the same thing, but also they might put their identical questions forward in an exaggerated, aggressive way. It goes on. And I'm comparing that, which we've all seen on television, with what you just said about the State Department press briefings, which I see much less frequently, but when I do, I see a very sharp contrast. And for the most part, what I would say I'm seeing in the State Department press briefings among the press corps, because I'm seeing the same professionalism at the podium, but the press corps at the State Department seem to believe that their job is to try to illuminate to their readers what you're doing and to illuminate for them what is happening. And at the White House, it seems that they think their job is to try to catch you at some kind of word game that leads to nothing.
It can be. And I think the State Department, it's the greatest job in government. But I mean, it was an amazing honor to be the White House press secretary. Dream job, twice a bridesmaid, finally was the bride on that one, which I talk about in the book. But the State Department taught me so much because those reporters, it is a remarkable press corps. They are absolutely brilliant. They are so, they want to get to the heart of the truth. They really do, and they work with each other to do it. And the rule in the State Department briefing room, which is different from the White House, is that you stay on the topic until they are ready to move on collectively as a group. That means I used to do 90-minute briefings there, and sometimes it was 58 minutes on China or 50 minutes on Middle East peace. Whatever they wanted to talk about, you didn't move on until they agreed to move on. Now, sometimes you said, guys, there's not much more I have to offer on this, so let's move on, or we're comfortable moving on. But it is a really remarkable. I will say about the White House briefing room, the reporters who cover the White House, it's a very hard job. It's a stressful job. I have a huge amount of respect for them and the job they do. The briefing room, the briefing which was televised under Mike McCurry, I think, Mike McCurry, who is, I write this in the book that I think he was remarkable at this job, and he was a model for me in so many ways and how he conducted himself in the job. And he had also been the State Department spokesperson before. Making it televised changes the tenor of the room. And that is not a critique of the reporters, it's a critique of what televising those exchanges can do. It's televised in the State Department too, it's just a different tenor in the room. So what I learned in the White House briefing room is that you have to provide the same context of information over and over and over, because combine television with social media and the clip of you saying, guys, we've answered this question 12 times, which would be factual, is what goes around. And then you become this flippant person who doesn't care about an issue that the public cares about. So the performative aspect is because of all of those factors.
So you just answered the first audience question.
Oh,
and
I didn't even know what it was.
No, and the answer is in this book, and so I already know the answer. Who is your favorite press secretary?
I think I love them all. Most of them. Mike McCurry, what I admired, the best press secretaries are the ones...
He was Bill Clinton's first or second? Anyway.
Second.
Yeah.
The best press secretaries or spokespeople or communications directors, whatever, are the ones who are almost an expert themselves.
Yeah.
Who know so much about the issues that they can be agile. Because it's really actually not about reading from a book. And it's not about having quippy things you say. It's about informing. And it's about being informed enough yourself and pushing the system inside. This is what people don't always see, and I talk about this in the book, about that job. You are advocating for the press by pushing the president, the national security advisors, and others to get you more information so that you can convey it to the press. And you're informing yourself through those conversations. So I think he did a really excellent job of that.
And years before you ever saw Mike McCurry doing his press secretary thing on TV, he was Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan's press secretary. And absolutely.
It's a full circle moment here. We need a Mike McCurry phone in.
Audience question again, would you be happy if one of your children chose a career in politics?
I would be. I think public service is a tremendous profession, and it's one where you work with some of the best human beings who are trying to do good that I've ever worked with. So I would be. Politics, if one of them ran for office, I'd be like, are you sure you want to do this? But yes.
This is a wise guy question from Jim about West Wing episodes, including one that I wrote. I'm going to put that over here.
Oh, Jim, we want to know it.
It's actually very clever. Jen, what did you think of the episode of The West Wing in which the new president, a minority, made one of his political opponents Secretary of State, Jen Psaki?
I loved it.
That was Jimmy Smith's making.
Alan Alda played the guy, right? Yeah. Didn't he play the Secretary of State?
Yes, guy? Alan Alda was the Republican.
He played the Republican. I will say, and I've told Lawrence this before, I left the Obama administration in 2011 because I was just fried, completely fried. I was like not even like functioning in daylight anymore. And I went back in part because I'd never seen The West Wing. I was a consultant. I was a terrible consultant, terrible. I write this in my book. No one's ever hired me to be a consultant again. But I went back because I watched the entire series of The West Wing.
So good.
And I was like, I have to go back to government. I want to be a part of that again.
Yeah, you know, I thought we were just doing an entertainment show. I didn't, and then years later, when some of the Obama speechwriters said to me, you know, we were in high school and we were watching your show and that made us want to do this. I thought, wow, we did something important.
Yeah.
What does Jen miss most and least about her time in the White House and in general her time in public service?
I miss the people, but I also miss the fact that you can walk into any room when you're the White House, almost any room, most of the rooms in the White House, and ask, what's going on here? What's the deal here? And now, I mean, you know, we all talk to tons of people, read tons to do our shows. It's not exactly the same as being able to walk into Jake Sullivan's office and be like, what's going on in this scenario here? Help me better understand. Even as I talk to all of them, it's not exactly the same. What do I miss the least? What'd you say? Peter Doocy. Oh, I actually have a good relationship with Peter Doocy, I will say. That may surprise people.
That, by the way, is one of the questions you always get.
I always get asked, what's he actually like?
No. The question you have here is, how much do you hate Peter Doocy? That's the question. That's the question that's in here. That's the way everyone else puts it. Thank you for putting it the polite way.
Thank you. I tried to kind of smooth that over. I didn't mean to. How much do I hate Peter Doocy? That's what I often get asked. I don't. But what I miss the least, probably waking up in like a cold sweat and looking at my phone to see what's on there, which now I don't do that as much anymore.
Yeah. I mean, for me, what I miss the most about working in government is the importance of the work. There's never a moment where you have the slightest doubt that going to work today is important. And that's something, you know, that at that level, I certainly never felt before or since.
It's very true. There are moments.
Everything you do after that is less important.
This is what Lawrence said to me, actually, when I started.
Oops. No, TV's really important. There was no civilization before it. You don't want to look at the world before 1950. Nothing.
That's right, exactly. It is very, and the huge gift I had by going back and serving as the White House press secretary was obviously doing the job, but I never thought I would go back to government. And being back, as my mother would say, who's in the book a lot, she's a therapist and she's very funny. She's from Queens, New York. She grew up in Queens. Yay, Queens.
By the way, mother as therapist is the secret weapon. When I came you come upon that sentence about 80 pages in, my mother's a therapist. You just go, okay, I get it. The whole thing makes sense now.
My mother would say, if somebody was driving me crazy, she says things like this, well, sweetheart, you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. And I'm like, what? But she has crazy sayings like that are in the book. Some of them are in the book.
How much does she charge for that one? I gotta say.
She's got a lot. Every old stocking finds an old shoe. That's another one of her favorites. I know it's a good one. My mother is in the book quite a bit. Yeah.
She is. All right, I'm going to read I was going to edit this out, edit me out. Okay, but I'll do it.
Don't do that.
You're both, I can't. You're both such impressive speakers, both in person and on TV and in print. To what do you attribute your ability to articulate your thoughts and opinions?
Well, a piece of advice you may not remember, after he told me that it didn't matter what I was doing, after he told me, because I was like, I'm going to go meet with Lawrence O'Donnell. He's going to tell me all these brilliant things. And, then we talked about the West Wing and public service, and it was great. And we bonded over that. But one of the pieces of advice Lawrence gave me, and others gave me when I started MSNBC, was do your own writing, write things if you can't figure out. I don't mean write everything. We have amazing producers we get to work with and writers and people. Some of them are here. Thank you, guys. But I don't mean that. I mean, if you can't figure out how to articulate something, write it down. And that is a piece of advice that I used when I was the White House press secretary. And now if I'm like, I can't figure out how to say something, I find I can articulate it better if I write it, bullets or a paragraph or whatever, when I'm just trying to kind of like clear my head of a thought.
For me, it's actually a one-word answer about if I ever sound articulate. Pressure.
Oh, that's
Pressure.
true too.
The intense pressure that you are putting on me right now to speak my best English and try to keep that Boston accent out of the room and speak in sentences and punctuation. And if you get me at the dinner table, sorry, it's going to be a mess. It's just a mess. It's pressure and the pressure of life. I hear myself say some things sometimes as a guest on television, and I think, that's good. Where did I come up with? It's like, no, you didn't. The pressure made it happen.
And sometimes we say things on television,
Oh,
or I do.
terrible. I do.
And I think, what was that point you
Right.
just made?
Why couldn't I get that question
I'm
out?
not clear what that was, but that also happened. So you have to have accepted and move on.
What keeps you optimistic that our democracy can survive? I'm sorry, can work, which is a different question from survive.
Can work.
You could ask that question even before the Trump era. What keeps you optimistic that our democracy can work? And if the answer is nothing, these people can take it. They're New Yorkers. They know what not being optimistic is.
I'm kind of an optimist by nature. I think one of the things that keeps me optimistic is actually some of the people who weirdly, leaving government, I've spent more time with politicians and elected officials who I didn't know well before than when I was in government, which sounds funny, but when you're working in the White House, you're just trying to survive every day, and you're obviously spending time with the president, which is great, but you're not kind of like hanging out with governors, right? And I have been able to go out and spend time out in states with Senator Warnock. I've spent time out with Governor Pritzker. I've spent time with Governor Whitmer. I've spent time with Governor Westmore, Governor Shapiro, so many, Governor Newsom. What gives me hope and optimism about our democracy is actually all of the people who are they're not on the bench, they're governors, but who are going to be future leaders of the country. And that does give me hope. And people much younger than them. I mean, I don't know if you guys have heard of somebody named Maxwell Frost. How old is he?
That's my audience up there because he made his first national television appearance at my hour.
Isn't he so? See, I love that.
Amazing.
I should have known that detail.
Yeah.
Or the Justins from Tennessee.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been working in politics. Yes, give them a round of applause. They're amazing. I've obviously been working in politics a long time. You have been. You can become cynical at times, but sometimes having a conversation with somebody like one of them makes you optimistic just by having those conversations. And that's something that's been such a gift for me of this kind of transition to a new job world.
The thing that I came out of government thinking and saying to people was that the very, very best thing that I know about government are the people who work there, the people who I worked with there, especially at the staff level and at the office holder level, that they were, certainly at the office holder level, a majority of them were better than you thought. And at the staff level, they were all better than you thought. They were not the soulless, faceless bureaucrats. They were people who had real dedication of purpose, had real motivation, all of whom, parenthetically, could have made more money at any point when they walked out and went across the street to the private sector. But they were there, and they all took the same oath of office that their boss took. Mm-hmm. Jen Psaki took exactly the same oath of office the President of the United States took. And she lived it, as fully and faithfully as you could ask her to do, and I'm so glad she's here tonight.
Thank you.